Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to share with you just some preliminary findings for a study that I consider is going to be longitudinal because there's a lot of talk about biodiversity conservation through ecotourism. And so, if we look at ecotourism, we would see always the words or the phrase ecological conservation, safeguarding ecological conditions, also protecting the environment. And community-based ecotourism is very important because, in fact, for a lot of ecotourism destinations, we're talking about remote areas with undisturbed environments, but within those areas, you cannot say it's a social vacuum, but you have persons living there who are relatively poor. And therefore, in the early 1990s and even the late 1980s, there was a push for ecotourism, not to be the panacea for developing countries, really, but to see how ecotourism can help to meet the needs, the ecological needs, in the context of conservation, and at the same time, provide some sort of economic incentive for the communities. So importantly, community-based ecotourism focuses on ownership and, of course, benefits to those persons. So this study here, I wanted to explore the degree to which ecotourism supports biodiversity conservation in the context of rural indigenous community in Guyana. And there are my research questions I want to read in the interest of time. But I use a mixed methods approach, starting with this review of the literature, a very rapid biodiversity assessment, followed by a social survey of 50 households, or 54. I want to just point out that Guyana is the only English-speaking country in South America. We are not in Africa. We are in South America between Venezuela and Suriname. And this particular community is in the heart of Guyana. It is near the Iwukurama Rainforest Project, which is internationally known. And you have Mukushis who live in this area, a very small area, 5 square miles. Now, basically, this particular community is well known in Guyana because of the work that they do in ecotourism. And in 2013, as you can see, they won the Caribbean Tourism Organization Excellence in Sustainable Tourism. And in fact, their vision statement talks about their commitment to resource management. These are just some of the biodiversity that are found in the community. So the household's dependence on biodiversity, because one thing you don't do in rural areas, you don't separate them from the environment. The ecological capital is very critical for their livelihoods. And therefore, most of the households, as we can see from the figures there, depend on they depend on the biodiversity for subsistence as well as for income generation. Now, importantly, all of the residents who were interviewed agree that biodiversity contributes to community ecotourism and should be conserved. In fact, they were able to point out that a number of the biodiversity species that they have serve as tourist attractions. They have over 500 species of birds, 72 species that are endemic to the Guyana Shield, which is the oldest shield, about 2 million years old. And of course, additional functions that they were able to look at. So the Surama Eco Lodge would have tours for tourists, and in fact, they have a rotational system in which 80%, more than 80% of the community benefits from this ecotourism. They've also managed within the community to link ecotourism with agriculture, also with the craft industry. Ecotourism, apart from contributing to incomes at the household level, also would contribute to the community income, the revenue for the community that would help to build infrastructure such as the first primary school that they had in the community. Now, 80% of them agreed that ecotourism does not pose a threat to biodiversity, and why. They have some standards for sustainable activities. For example, in 1997, the community banned all illegal hunting, and you cannot do illegal trapping of birds. So within the community, there's an agreement that there is sustainability if you were to leave the species for ecotourism rather than for consumptive use or for illegal trading. The households have benefited, of course, from the conservation education programs that would have been organized by the Ecotourism International Center, so that education has allowed them to have a different kind of attitude towards the biodiversity. Ecotourism requires biodiversity conservation to maintain natural capital, and that is being told to all of the households. Even the students who are at the school, that's what they learn at a very early level. But there were some concerns of the local people. If you have too many tourists, then there's going to be a problem. The whole issue of loss of culture, unintended harm by tourists, and of course the rapid development of the tourist industry or the tourism sector in the context of the community because of improved access to the area. And so they were able to identify a number of recommendations, for example, stricter laws and rules for the community to scale up the awareness and education programs, to strengthen monitoring. In 2015, they collaborated with the Ecotourism International Center, and they did some monitoring of the wildlife. They were able to show some trend analysis there. And so they're also able to identify which species might be under threat. Also, they try to orient tourists as they enter into the community and to sort of caution them against any harmful practices. The other recommendation, of course, is to introduce a quota system, which obviously has to do with the social carrying capacity of the community. So what are the concluding statements from this initial work? First of all, if ecotourism is managed in a sustainable way, it can provide an effective incentive for biodiversity conservation. I think that once we recognize, especially policymakers, once we recognize that in these areas that are tourist destinations, you do have indigenous communities or you have rural communities that surround the area, live in the area, and therefore it will not be right to just isolate them from the whole process. The other issue is that the households did derive a number of socioeconomic benefits. In fact, in another analysis that I did, I showed where the households that benefited from ecotourism were above the poverty line. So it was making a difference in terms of their quality of life. But an important point to note is that we cannot, because it's a case study, we cannot generalize and say that ecotourism fully supports biodiversity conservation. In the context of my work, I think that the institutional structure, the arrangement for ecotourism is important. In this way, it was community-based, it's owned by the community. The community decided what rules they're going to have, and of course, it was not only the sort of extrinsic, what we were talking about this morning, but also the intrinsic value of biodiversity. And lastly, to say that in the context of Guyana, we've been talking a lot about payment for ecosystem services. We have a memorandum of understanding with the government of Norway over 5 years, 250 million US dollars. And so we've just done a study looking at how communities can obtain so that they can live, they can preserve the forest, but they can be paid for that sort of preservation. So this is just, that's another alternative. Thank you very much.
So we have time for maybe 2 questions from the audience.
or was the idea brought to them?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. The, in 1989, the then president of Guyana in Kuala Lumpur decided to set aside about 1 million acres of forest, virgin forest of Guyana, under a Commonwealth program to demonstrate sustainable forestry management. But the Iwokrama forest is surrounded by at least 16 indigenous communities. And therefore, it was important for the staff of the Iwokrama Center to find alternatives that would allow persons to protect the forest, and at the same time, they can still derive the subsistence. So importantly, Guyana is one of the few countries, perhaps the only one in Latin America, that has a legislation for protected area system that allows indigenous people to derive their subsistence from the forest. So that after they were made aware of the importance of looking at non-consumptive use of the forest, they also decided at the community level, the Surama Development Council, Administrative Development Council, decided that they're going to just embrace the concept of ecotourism. And so that is how it really started.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. So thank you, Paulette. And we will
Sorry.
be moving on to our, sorry.
One last quick question. Thank you. And actually, for anybody who hasn't been there, highly suggest it. It's a wonderful place to visit. Could you quickly talk a little bit about the potential of the main road being paved and what the effect on the community might be, please?
Yes, the Georgetown to Lethem road, of course, it is a concern because one of the issues that was raised is the increased accessibility to the area. And so what is happening, you have a number of persons from the coast who will commute along the highway and even in the interior areas, and they would be involved in illegal trapping of the biodiversity. So what has been happening recently, the Iwokrama Center, together with the Guyana Police Force, and of course the Environmental Protection Agency, they've come together as a team, and they have increased monitoring along the road. Thank you.
Thank you.